Last week, we studied from the book of James. And James 1 instructed us to be swift to hear and slow to speak and slow to anger or slow to wrath. For the anger of man does not work the righteousness of God. And as we were talking about that, it was commented by several that anger was a thing that they had to deal with. And I thought to myself, actually, anger is something that we all have to deal with. Because every single one of us has had various times in our life when we were ticked off. That somebody said something or did something or didn't do something, and it just made us angry. So I'm going to talk about anger, just expounding a little further on it than we talked about last week. Because I'm trying to be and imitate God's character. And Nehemiah in the Old Testament, when he was rehearsing the sins of Israel, he said down at the end of that God is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness. And thus God did not forsake them. And if I want to be a child of God and to be like God, to be like my Father, I need to be slow to anger. I need to learn to control the anger. That's what Brother Curtis read to us from Genesis 4. That Cain was angry, and God called him on it. It's an amazing thing. And God said, "Why are you angry? Why are you wroth?" In the old thing. "If you do well, will your countenance not be lifted up?" And the answer is yes. "And if you don't do well, sin lies at the door and it wants to conquer you." And what Cain had to see was sin was there, but he didn't have to do it. But he's going to have to resist. He's going to have to learn to conquer it. He must deal with that. And then Curtis read the next verse. Cain killed his brother. He didn't overcome. He didn't control. He gave vent to his anger and his feelings, and he carried it out in life, and he killed his brother. A man that is trying to serve God doesn't do that. Cain offered sacrifice, but Cain's heart was wrong with God. A heart that is right with God would not have killed his brother. So he was one of those hypocrites from the very beginning, and anger was there from the very beginning. Amazing. From the very beginning that this was a major problem. And thus we learn in the New Testament that no temptation, including anger, has befallen you except that which is common to man. It started with Cain and Abel. And do you know how many people have been angry over the years? And the answer is, it's common. It happens. Do you not cringe when you turn on the news or read the paper, or if you ever take a paper anymore, turn it on the internet? Have you seen the anger in people's faces and hear their voices shouting the wars? There's something like 50 or 60 different places in the world today that are at war. Hatred and anger and shooting and killing. And the world has not learned what Cain didn't learn. They've not learned to control the anger. And anger happens, and Paul said, be angry. Now that's not a commandment. That is, this is going to happen to you. But when it happens, don't be like Cain. Be angry, but don't you sin. Do not give in to your anger, Do not give in to the feelings. Do not give in to the temptation. And so God warned Cain because anger is dangerous. Anger does not work the righteousness of God. In our anger, we do that which is displeasing to God, and we're not doing what is right. Anger grows and it escalates. The proverb says the beginning of strife is like the letting out of water. You remember the story about the little boy and the finger in the dike. And the problem is, a little hole in the dike becomes a bigger hole, becomes a bigger hole, becomes a bigger hole. And that's what happens with anger. It starts small and it grows. That's what happened to Cain. It started small, and the more he thought about it, the angrier he got until he exploded. And so anger is dangerous. It needs to be stopped when it starts and not given time, because it will simply grow. And the growth of that will bring the punishment. A man of great anger, said the Proverbs, will bear the penalty. A man that gives in to that anger will do things that are to be punished, and he will be punished. And so I, unlike Cain, need to work on and strive to control the anger. Anger gives way. And it starts with anger and it gives into strife. I like the proverb illustration. I've never had anybody do this, but like the churning of the milk will produce butter, and that I have done, but the pressing of the nose brings forth blood. The old King James says the twisting of it. As if, when you're little and your big brother comes up to you and he grabs you by the nose, and it hurts. Now, if you've never had a big brother, you may not understand that, but just as assuredly as doing that is going to bring hurt and pain and blood, so giving vent to your anger is going to bring forth strife. That's the response. In Proverbs 29, verse 22, an angry man stirs up strife, and a hot-tempered man abounds in transgression. Do you see how many times? Now, I have a whole pile of scriptures this morning you're going to read. I'm not going to spend much time explaining them because they're self-explanatory. But I know that even with all those scriptures, you're not going to be angry at me when I get overtime, right? But the problem with anger is that it brings forth sin. The anger is an emotion. That is not sin in itself. But anger, when we address that and when we give into that, it brings forth sin. And so in Galatians, the work of the flesh is anger. And then these other words: strife, wrath, bitterness, clamor, evil speaking, malice, contempt, fighting, assault, and finally murder. So it started over here with just an emotion of anger. But as I give way to the feeling and the emotion, it grows and grows and grows. Now, most of us have learned to cut it off before we killed somebody, but not before it gendered strife and contempt, and we didn't stop it soon enough. And so, what we learn is that the expression of the anger, not the anger is an emotion and it happens, but the expression of that anger is that which is learned. Proverbs 22 said, "Do not make friends with a man that is given to anger, and with a wrathful man thou shalt not go, lest you learn his ways." What you learned was not the emotion. What you learned was, here's how I express that emotion. For example, and I know this is overstating the case, but for example, in the Japanese culture, when they got angry, they got quiet. And in the Italian culture, when they got angry, they got boisterous. And guess what? That was the culture. I read of one tribe that they found. And the way that they learned to deal with anger, when somebody got angry, the whole village gathered around and began laughing. Until finally the person that was angry just started laughing. And you can learn to respond to the anger in a different way. And that's what God expects us to do. He expects us to learn how to control the emotion of anger by controlling how I respond and what I do to that. It is to be controlled. That's why James said, slow to wrath. That's a commandment. It means you can do that. You can learn that when I'm angry, I don't just give in and respond, but I control and I choose how I'm going to respond and what I'm going to do. This was an old thing. James quotes a lot from the Old Testament, from Proverbs, that he who is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who is quick-tempered exalts folly. You can choose to be slow to anger or quick to anger. There were some people that I've known in my life that they just gave in to anger. The moment anything happened, we use the expression, they exploded. And yet there's other people that you can do things to them and they just hold on. It's not that they're not having the emotion on the inside. It's that they have learned to control the response to what's going on with the emotion. So, Proverbs 16, verse 32, he who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who captures a city. And here again, the ruling of your anger. The emotion is there, but you've learned how to respond. Now, we make heroes out of these mighty men. And God makes heroes out of the person that can learn to control himself. The biggest enemy I have is me. My will, my choices, my actions. I need to control myself. Slow to anger. Proverbs 15, it says that a hot-tempered man stirs up strife, but he that is slow to anger calms a dispute. Which one of those two am I? Proverbs 37, we're simply told, quit it. Well, that's my translation. Cease from anger. Now, the emotion's going to be there. So I understand this. It's not that I can't. Did you ever have your parents say, don't feel that way? How? That's what I feel. The feeling is not necessarily bad. But the response to the feeling, giving in to the feeling. And so God says, cease from anger and forsake wrath. Do not fret, it only leads to more evil doing. And in the New Testament version of that, it says, put off anger and wrath and malice and slander and abusive speech from your mouth. Starts with the emotion, the anger, and then look what it produces. All of these side effects are how we've learned to respond to the feeling of anger. We need to learn that thus the expression of my anger is in fact a choice. I can't help it. Yes, you can. The problem is, it's really a secondary emotion. You don't just sit there eating cornflakes in the morning and all of a sudden you're angry. Now, if you're eating cornflakes in the morning and you go to pour the milk on and there's no milk. But you see, it wasn't just an emotion. It's a secondary emotion. Something happens in my life, and my response to that is the emotion of anger. Somebody says something, or somebody does something, or somebody doesn't do something. And I become angry. So, as we begin to learn this, we begin seeing that the anger in my life has to do with some type of stress. And it may be something that is easy to get over, and maybe something that's really difficult to get over, but it is a response to the stress. I need to learn, what am I responding to? And then respond to that, trying to fix that, not giving in to the anger. We choose how we're going to respond from this. And most of us, unfortunately, choose to give in to the anger as a problem solver. I've known people like this. Situation happens and immediately, because they're going to control the situation. And the way they control the situation is by the explosiveness of their actions, giving in to the anger. And you can do that if you want to. But the Bible says over and over and over again, you fool. Giving in to it is a foolish thing indeed. A fool's anger is known all at once, but a prudent man conceals his dishonor. The contrast, the man giving in to his anger versus an honorable man. And the fool that gives vent to his anger, it happens quickly because he's not learned to control it. A quick-tempered man acts foolishly, and a man of evil devices is hated. Giving vent to your anger is foolish. He who is slow to anger, he has great understanding. But he who is quick-tempered exalts folly. It's foolishness. And yet, we see it. You watch the news, if you can stand to do it, and you see the people. You turn on, and I'll just pick on it, you turn on Fox News in the morning, and they're having the talking heads. I used to go visit my dad, and he would turn that on in the morning and lay down on the couch and go to sleep, but he was hard of hearing. So the TV was turned up really loud. And I'd walk in the house to visit with my mother, and here is these two people, and they're talking at one another in loud voices with the TV turned up, and nobody is listening. They're not listening to each other, and my dad's asleep. He's not listening either. And that's what happens with anger. They're not solving anything. They're not dealing with anything. They're just venting their anger, and sometimes their faces get red. And he that is slow to anger has great understanding, but to give in to it is just plain foolishness. So do not be eager in your heart to be angry, for anger resides in the bosom of the fools. I could have quoted 20 more verses. Now, I know you didn't write all of these down, so I printed out a little handout, and as you go out on the table, there's a little handout. It has all these verses and all these points, and take that and put it in the back of your Bible, memorize it, and learn to control. Because giving vent to the anger comes with great costs. There's always consequences to our actions. Every action. And if our action is now come from anger, and it produces wrath and strife, there's punishment. There's a consequence to all of that. First of all, it costs physically. High blood pressure. Why do their faces get red and their necks swell and they've raised their blood pressure? And for some, that's a very dangerous concept to go into. But if you do that all the time, you're destroying your own body. It gives into acidic stomach, which produces ulcers. And so, giving in has problems. But learning to control the anger allows you to be level-headed and at ease, even though the situation around you may be chaos. I can learn to control that. And one of the things that I've often seen is, the biggest thing is it happens in our relationships. I did not have an angry father, but my neighbor did. And what happened with that is the response of his father was always an outburst of anger, and oftentimes a slap upside the head or grabbing the belt. And what happened was the child learned to fear. And out of fear, he learned to avoid. And by avoiding his dad, he destroyed the relationship between father and son. But it was the dad that was giving vent to his anger in order to control the situation. Or, for example, many husbands will use anger to try to control their wife. Who needs to control their wife? My wife has more common sense than I do. I don't need to control her. I need to control me. And so the problem is, when you try to control, you bully and you browbeat, and some actually beat. I counseled a young man one time, and he came in and he was telling me how his wife doesn't love him anymore. And I said, well, what'd you do? He said, well, when she does something dumb, I put her in her room and lock the door. Well, that'll make her love you. That just makes her feel really good all over. No. You're not her father. You're not her parent. You're not her disciplinarian. And so anger, when it's used in our relationship, it produces hurt, it produces fear, it produces resentment, it produces mistrust. I've seen bosses, supervisors, that try to supervise with fear. And they produce the fear by anger. And nobody wanted to work for them. And nobody went out of the way. And it produced discord and fear and mistrust. Don't go there. It's only hurtful to yourself when you do that. You may control the moment with that, but in the long run, you lose. You lose the relationship, you lose the love, you just can't do that. Experience teaches us that it's counterproductive because it's ineffective in any long-term relationship. And the truth is, there are better choices to make. Now, this is a long list, and you're just going to have to get the paper and try some of these. For example, laughing. Sometimes humor works. But if that doesn't work, go work out. I was so mad at one young man that was mistreating his wife that when he walked out and he was still not getting the point, I decided I'd put on my tennis shoes and I'd go for a run till I felt better. 6 miles later, and I'd got a bone crack in the foot, I felt better. I'm not sure you got to work out that much, but I'm going to tell you. You need to do something to dissipate your anger that is productive to yourself. To exercise, to relax, recreation, go play racquetball, go take swimming, sometimes crying. Sit down and write. I was told one time, when you have a problem with somebody, sit down and write them a letter. And then burn it. Don't send it. It is the writing of the letter that allows you to express what's going on, and then you can begin seeing, this is my problem. This is how I can deal with that. Or listening to music, or resting, take a nap, verbalizing this, setting some type of solving activity for the problem. Yeah, my point is this. We're different people with different temperaments, different choices in life. But find what works for you. And when you are angry, choose to respond. Somebody says, I can't help it. Let me give you an illustration. Your wife wants to make a whole bunch of deviled eggs. I have no idea why anybody does that. So you go down and you buy 24 eggs. And you're walking out of H-E-B, and just as you walk out, some 10-year-old runs up, looks you in the eye, and knocks the eggs out of your hand. And I'm going to tell you the response will be the emotion of anger, and you grab him by the collar. And all of a sudden, from behind you, you hear a voice. What are you doing with my son? And you turn around, and he's 6'8", 340 pounds, in one of those muscle shirts, and he's standing there looking down at you. And I'm going to tell you what, your anger left. It disappeared. You choose to put him down. You choose how you respond. Sometimes it just takes a better intimidation, a better influence. And so we can control the anger if we have a good enough reason. And I'm going to tell you, trying to please God should be a good enough reason. We have read now how many scriptures? Don't give in to anger, or else. And there is the or else. So we put away that. And so we deal with that. You step back and you identify what the real problem is. Not the stress that it's causing, but what is causing the stress? How do I deal with that? How can I solve this? How can we together work through this? Trying to identify that, not giving in. Slow down. How many of you have heard the good old advice? Count to 10. Let me up the ante. Not 10, but 10 times 10 times 10. Whatever it takes. Learn to slow down. Don't respond immediately. But think about it. Take time. And keep your mouth shut. Slow to speak. Slow to anger. That's what James said. So learn. Don't respond. Think about it. If somebody comes up to you and says something, think about it. Have they told you the truth? Are they talking with you about something that you've done or need to do or need to change? Think about it. Maybe it's correct. Maybe they're your friend and they're helping you. But you don't take advice very well. And so the anger, and then you respond. So learn to control your tongue and then choose your actions. Jesus told the story about if someone slaps you on the right cheek, to turn the other cheek. I'm going to tell you one of the lessons I've learned from that. I am supposed to live by actions, not reactions. I don't just react to people, I act. Now, I may be responding to what they have done, but I am acting. I'm doing it. I need to choose how I respond in all of that. So, what did we learn? Be angry and sin not. Be swift to hear and slow to speak and slow to wrath. If you want all these scriptures that are on that paper, grab one as you walk out. If you are a sinner, God is angry. But God has the ability to control His anger, and He will respond by loving you and offering you forgiveness, allowing His Son to die that you can be saved from your own anger and sin. Why not respond? If you're willing to do that, Jesus said, "He that believes and is baptized shall be saved," and you can be saved through Jesus today. As together we stand and sing, won't you